What's up, guys? John the Pilot at John the Pilot. This is my YouTube channel dedicated solely to aviation content. Today, what we're going to talk about is a question I get hit up all the time. I have military experience. I was in the Army for about 8 years. I was a U.S. Army Black Hawk pilot. Love flying helicopters. And then since then, I have switched over to fly airplanes, and now I work for a major airline. Question I get hit up all the time is, should I join the military to become a pilot? Well, there's a lot of information about that and why you should or shouldn't. So I'm going to try to touch on it because I'm pretty sure this video can go down a rabbit hole. So let's get into it. But first, got to test out the bed. So the United States has got actually 5 military services that offer opportunities to become a pilot. First one's the Air Force. They got jets and helicopters. Second one, Navy. They've got jets, helicopters, or airplanes, helicopters, just like the Air Force. The Marines has airplanes and helicopters. The Army has airplanes and helicopters, surprisingly. Everybody thinks about helicopters because I was a helicopter pilot in the Army. And last but not least, nobody ever thinks about the Coast Guard. Yeah, Coast Guard, you poor fellas. They have opportunities and they've got helicopters and airplanes as well. So which one would you choose? Well, first, let's talk about the Air Force. To my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it's been a while since I have been away from it. The Air Force requires very stringent medical requirements. I don't know if they've changed them. I'm not 100% sure on that. But the Air Force does require that you have to have a 4-year degree. And then you have to go through a selection process to become a pilot. It's pretty competitive. It's one thing to think about, right? And the next thing is the Air Force also has a 10-year contract. That means if you get accepted into flight school this day and age, what happens is you're on an active duty contract, handcuffed for 10 years. That means if you're trying to get to a major airline, you ain't going to be able to do it except for 10 years later. So as far as the way the hiring is going to be going for the major airlines 10 years from now, I'm pretty sure it's going to drastically slow down. That's something to think about. As far as I understand, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the Marines, the U.S. Navy, even the Army, right, have significantly increased their contracts to become a pilot. When I joined the U.S. Army, my contract was upon the completion of flight school that I had to serve 6 years total. Okay, to my understanding, that has now increased to 8 years if you're going to be a warrant officer. And I'll explain that in greater detail, hopefully, when I get down the line from the other subjects that I would like to talk about when it comes to joining the military. Now, as far as the Marines and the Navy, to my understanding, you have to sign a contract upon completion of flight school at 8 years. Flight school can vary on how long it takes for one to get through it. First and foremost, when you join any military, you're going to have to go to their indoctrination and or what we call an Army boot camp. Boot camp is where you learn how to be a grunt, a soldier, a basic airman in the Air Force, or a sailor, Coast Guard. I don't know, Coastie, what do you guys call yourselves? Coasties? I don't know. My point is this, is that you go in and you join. When you sign the contract on the dotted line, when you start that training, you haven't even entered into flight school yet. So your contract hasn't even kicked in. Then from there, you're probably going to have to go to some type of officer schooling or training. In the United States Army, when I went, I became a warrant officer, which was an additional 6 weeks of schooling upon 3 months of basic training, also known as boot camp. And then finally, I went into warrant officer flight training when I graduated warrant officer candidate school. When I went into flight training, what happened was I started off in IERW, which is initial entry rotary wing. And then from there, I learned instrument skills, combat skills, and then I went into my advanced airframe, which was the UH-60 Black Hawk. The total time it took me to get through flight school was just about a year and a month. So my contract did not start until after all of that, okay? So that's where I stayed in the Army for about 8 years. Now, because there are so many people leaving the U.S. military services to join the airlines, they have now increased the contract to hold personnel. Makes total sense. They've also increased the bonuses from what I understand, but I'm not sure how much that's holding around. Maybe I could get into another video about that. So if you join the military, this is a huge thing that everybody has to consider. As soon as you sign that dotted line and Uncle Sam owns you, Uncle Sam owns you. Whatever the needs of that military service, at that moment, guess what's going to happen? That's going to happen to you. So if you cannot be one of those people that can sacrifice and also do what somebody else tells you, especially if you don't like that person, chances are the military is not going to be right for you. Now, with all that being said, you join the military, you sign the contract, you do 10 years, 8 years, and I think the Coast Guard is probably 8 years if I'm not mistaken. All of your flight training is paid for. But something to consider, if you're on active duty, guess what? You are actively going to be working for that military service for that time. And if you're trying to go to the civilian sector and fly for a major airline, like what I'm lucky enough to do right now, I don't know exactly what the hiring situation will be at that point. The projections are that there are tons of pilots needed for the next 20, 30 years. Okay. However, if you look in the news right now, there are some airlines that have either stopped hiring, such as American Airlines. They're citing they're not getting any aircraft from Boeing. Same as Southwest. They're not hiring. They've closed their doors. And I understand JetBlue at this moment has also closed their doors for hiring due to aircraft issue. These issues, as we all know, Boeing had the doors blowing off left and right, and also the Pratt & Whitney engine issues are also something other air carriers are experiencing. Both Spirit Airlines and JetBlue Airlines are the primary recipients of the problem with those Pratt & Whitneys because they use the Airbus A320 variants 319s that use that engine, and they've had to slow their hiring because they just don't have the fix for the engine yet, so a lot of aircraft are sitting. Not only that, they also were blocked with their merger, so there are tons of economic factors that are also going to play a part in how airlines hire. All right, now that we've talked about all that and you're still deciding that you want to join the military and maybe you've picked your service, it's going to be very, very important for you to figure out what the education requirements are and also what the physical fitness standards are, because you're going to need to prepare. All right. So at the time, I know I've gained a little bit of LBage. My point is this, is that when I joined the U.S. Army, all right, first and foremost, I didn't have a degree. I was lucky enough to have a lot of helicopter licenses. I had a commercial helicopter pilot license along with a certified flight instructor. So I fit the requirements for the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program. It's also known Seat to Street, at least from my era. And what happened was they took me right off the bat. I signed a contract to go through boot camp, then to go right into Warrant Officer School, from Warrant Officer go right into flight training. And that's how my situation started. I didn't need a degree with the Army. I'm pretty sure the Army still does not require a degree if you're going to be a warrant officer. However, there was basic training considerations for the physical standards test, the PT test. It is completely different from the time that I have been in. What I'm going to do is put some resources down below to show what the test standards are. And it's a good idea right now, if you're not in shape, to start thinking about that, okay, for any of these military services. So that was the Army. Air Force, they're probably going to require a 4-year degree because it's very competitive to get in there. Plus the Air Force standards, especially when it comes to the physical fitness, I'm pretty sure that they have a very stringent physical fitness test for you to go through airman basic training, then officer candidate school, and then to get into flight school. Those are some things you want to consider. Now, just moving on, the Navy and the Marines, especially the Marines, are extremely physically demanding. I know the Marine physical fitness test is by far, what I understand, one of the hardest tests to pass. I don't know if they still do a 3-mile run or not, but you better start thinking before you join the military to start really working out and getting yourself into really good physical shape, because trust me, when you're in basic training and you're already stressed out from drill instructors or drill sergeants yelling at you, the last thing you need to be is out of breath or in a situation where your physical stress is so high that you end up breaking down mentally and physically. Not a good place to be. Something to think about. As far as education standards, the Army does not require a degree if you're going to be a warrant officer. If you're going to be a commissioned flight officer, they will require a degree. The Air Force, the Navy, the Marines all require you to be an officer, which their requirements are, in order to become an officer, to be a pilot, you must have completed a 4-year degree. So start thinking about that, getting on it right away, especially if you're watching this and you're probably just about to graduate from high school. Start thinking about your grades, start thinking about getting into a college and all those things so you can be competitive. All right, cool. Now let's talk about, you've got accepted and you signed a contract and you are now joining the military to become a pilot. So what could possibly happen? Interesting. This is going to be very important for you to pay attention to what that recruiter told you and also put on that piece of paper that you signed, because it very specifically stated on my contract that if I could not pass flight school, I would have been an infantry soldier. Not that I would have mind, because quite honestly, later on in life, I really like working with a lot of law enforcement guys on the ground. I had a blast, absolute blast. Thank you for your service if you're law enforcement out there, or if you're infantry, or if you're on the ground and you're doing all that good stuff for the United States of America. I appreciate you. When you join, you sign that contract. Flight school is going to be extremely hard and demanding. You're going to have very long days. You're going to wake up very early. You're going to go to the flight line. You're going to fly the aircraft that they have you flying for training. After that, you may have ground school in the evening, and your day might as well be a 10-hour or a 12-hour day, and then you're going to have to stay in physical shape. So, a lot of stuff going on. You're going to be dealing with competing with the other candidates in your class in order to make the cut, especially when it comes to test scores, or you're going to be stressing yourself out because you want to make good enough grades and be at the top of your class to possibly get the duty station that you want and or the aircraft, because those are extremely competitive. That was what I saw when I was going through U.S. Army flight school. Everybody all the time would always be asking, hey John, because I was lucky enough to already know how to fly. I stayed at the top of my class. All right, I was actually number 2 because of a medical thing, but anyway, we're not going to get into that. Everybody would ask me at the end, where are you going to pick, because they wanted to see what was going to be left over. I was very fortunate to be in a very good position to get the base that I wanted, because I wanted to be a medevac pilot. So I woke up about 4:30 in the morning. I would show up and do PT, physical training. We go do our 2-mile run and whatever push-ups and sit-ups that we would do. Then I would have to rush really quickly, shower, get to the flight line, please my flight instructor, who was a retired Vietnam helicopter pilot, and make sure I knew everything verbatim when it came to the TH-67, and spit out limitations, emergency procedures, and all the standards that we needed when we were flying a traffic pattern, such as altitudes, the approach angles, you name it. I had to spit it out verbatim, and that had to happen every day, along with everybody else that I flew with and I was competing with in my class. Some of the people could not make the cut. It was very stressful. Another thing I want to add on to that is, if you're married and you have kids, your support system is going to be extremely important during this process. They're going to have to understand your days are going to be horribly long. Monday through Friday in flight school you're going to be exhausted. I don't care who you are, what you're doing, how awesome you were. I already knew how to fly helicopters. I was exhausted because I had to go to study groups, and I would go and make sure that I knew what I was getting ready for the next day's lesson, whether it was ground school in the morning or fly line in the afternoon. And then I would also find time for me to go ahead and make sure I maintain my physical fitness. I was 21 years old. I didn't have kids. I did not have a wife. I had a lot of free time, theoretically. When you have a family and you have responsibilities, you're going to have to be one heck of a time balancer manager. That is something to consider. I'm sure you got tons of questions, and I've got tons of advice. I want to connect with you, and I want to share that advice. Find me on Connect. It's a new app by Valuetainment, and what it does is it allows experts like me to connect with you to know that you're serious about the answers you're looking for. I will respond to you extremely quick, generally within a day, probably even sooner than that, and I would love to share my experience, knowledge, anything that you may need to help you on your aviation journey. If you're coming out of the military and you're looking to use your VA benefits to get your airplane licenses, helicopter pilot licenses, guess what? I've done that. I know how to do that. If you're having trouble maintaining your medical, I've been through the special issuance process. I can point you in the right direction. Or if you just have any type of career advice questions, anything that's coming up for an interview, please reach out to me. I'd love to help you. Find me on Connect. It's John Hantzis, JohnHantzis. Download Connect, get it on your iPhone, get it on your Android, and connect with me so we can have a chat. See you soon. One thing I wanted to talk about was the qualifications in order to become a military pilot. You're going to be taking some very specific exams, especially from the get-go, that are going to be used in your packet that your recruiter puts together in order for you when you're in your application. You get the packet, the recruiter takes it, and they put it to the flight evaluation board for whatever military service you're going to be doing. So it's important for you to know what the ASVAB is. The ASVAB is your beginning basic military test that's going to test everything from your, math skills to your motor skills, as far as your, I would say a little bit of quasi almost engineering. Like, they give you, I remember when I took it, there was a little diagram, and what it would do is ask you, if you push this here and there was a pivot point here and there was a weight attached to the stick, what would happen? And you'd have to be able to select the correct answer. I was very fortunate. My ASVAB score was more than high enough in order to qualify me for the Warrant Officer Flight Training Program, and therefore I could move forward through the process, be interviewed by other pilots, and go through the evaluation board in order to get selected to be an Army helicopter pilot. The Air Force, the Marines, the Navy, the Coast Guard are all very similar in their processes. The person who's going to know the best is going to be a recruiter. My advice to you, when you find a recruiter, first thing you ask them, do you know the steps and the requirements for me to become a pilot, or at least apply to be a pilot for this military service? Very important, be very direct. The other thing too, I want you to pay attention to, military recruiters have bosses, sergeants or lieutenants or colonels above them, saying they need to fit bodies into these positions which possibly have nothing to do with flying, and they may try to sell you on that. So be very, very careful. Now, as far as ASVAB, and I had to take the AFAST. The AFAST was the Army's version of the pre-test. Man, I don't even know how to tell you how to prepare for this thing, because the Army Flight Aptitude Standards Test, the AFAST, is what gave me questions to see if my brain functioned the way they needed me to in order to get through flight training. I did very well on it and I passed, but there was really no way to prepare for it because there were psychological questions and all that stuff. I'm going to go ahead and leave a link in the description for possible resources for you for whatever service you're choosing to join, if you're choosing to join, to be able to prepare for those tests and to start getting into that thought process. Something to think about.
The great news is now there are so many resources available. All you have to do is do some simple searches on the internet, and guess what? There are books out there that will help you prepare for all this stuff, and they'll even help point you in the right direction. Back in early 2000, none of this stuff was available. Look at this one right here. I got all the links in the description for you.
My experiences in the Army, especially after I finished flight school, one thing I want everybody to wrap their head around is that, remember when I told you sign it on the dotted line and then now you're in a service agreement where you have a contract? I don't know if you've been paying attention to the news, but during the time I joined, 9/11 just happened. I remember going to basic training, and that was when President Bush dropped the hammer and said, we're going to Afghanistan and we're also going to Iraq. So while I'm going through flight school the whole time, I'm knowing that we are going to be deploying to either Iraq or Afghanistan as soon as I was done. Here's the kicker. I had no choice in the matter. I knew for a fact that I was going to go to Iraq or Afghanistan. Now looking back at it, I had an absolute blast serving 3 years in Iraq as a medevac pilot. I did some great things. I participated in saving lots of lives. I enjoyed it very thoroughly. I'll tell you this, I'm glad I did it. I don't know, quite honestly, if I would do it again, because when you go to war, things are, you change a little bit. You come back home, you don't see things the same way you used to, especially before you were exposed to situations where you can see the utmost cruelty and humanity. Something to think about. Okay, so another thing to consider is when you become a military pilot, even though I was a warrant officer in the United States Army, my primary purpose was to fly helicopters. You are still taught, at least when I was in, that I was a soldier first, then I was an officer, then I was an aviator. So what does that mean? I know if you join any of the services where you're a commissioned officer, from some of the other guys that I've been flying with, what they tell me is, Air Force pilots always tell me that when you get to the level of Lieutenant Colonel, which is 05, and you're going to become an 06, which is a full bird colonel, you may not be flying as much as you think you would be. For the same reason in the Army, I noticed that commission officers, which I was telling you about, which have a lower service agreement. I think they are 6 years in the Army. Please don't quote me on that. Your recruiter will really know. The thing is that I would watch, as I was a warrant officer and I would be doing my time in the United States military, I would be progressing from a pilot to a pilot in command, being in charge of the aircraft we were flying. And I would see commissioned officers, they were more worried about them being in charge of the unit with all the aircraft. So their primary job was to manage all of that stuff, occasionally lead. You guys know what I mean if you're a warrant officer watching this. Manage all that stuff and then fly every once in a while to keep their currency. Meanwhile, in the Army, the warrant officers usually tracked 4 different things. Those 4 different things were you could become an instructor pilot as a warrant officer, you become a maintenance test pilot as a warrant officer, or you can become a safety officer and or a tactical operations officer. So the instructor pilot in the U.S. Army, what does he do? He flies with the other pilots and he makes sure that their yearly requirements are up to snuff and they can practice their emergency procedures, and they basically handle all that admin inside the Army unit. Maintenance test pilot, exactly what it sounds like. Aircraft break, they need to be fixed. Okay, what that maintenance test pilot does, goes through a huge service manual and makes sure they follow the steps and the procedures to fix the aircraft. And then they do the test flights to make sure that everything is hunky-dory. All right, safety. The safety officer, what they do is they make sure whatever the requirements are for the United States Army that have been going on, is that they are making sure the unit complies with all that, all the way from the standards when it comes to what's going on in the building to the actual flying and how they're everybody's operating their missions. And they also make sure, I don't know, for whatever reason, I just remember them, they always carried a yellow can of paint everywhere, and they would basically be sitting there painting stuff, especially when somebody bumped their head. Anyway, that was safety, I remember. Now, TAC Ops. What is TAC Ops? Tactical Operations Officers. We kind of called it the sham job, I'm just being honest. But the cool thing is that if you are a hard charger, you got into planning a lot of troop movements, a lot of huge operations. You know, when the Bush Surge Force happened, which I was a part of back in 2006 to 2008, there were tons of tactical operations where they were going through and they were trying to clean up and organize and making sure that they could secure the facilities in Iraq from all the insurgent activity that was happening. Those warrant officers had a huge role to play, especially for the air movements, so tactical operations. Another thing too is generally they had access to very, very important intelligence so that they could be a part of the planning process, especially when it came to helicopters. I know in the medevac unit, not so much, because we were very reactionary, and what we would do is we would just get a mission because somebody was hurt and we needed to get them from point A to B. It could have been in a combat situation, or it could have been where we pick somebody up and then we'd be into a real intense firefight and we'd take them and lift them to safety and bring them over to a hospital, a CASH, a combat support hospital that was in Iraq at the time. Or we could have literally landed at one base and then bring them to another base, which was generally a little bit less eventful. That is the Army. The Marines is going to have similar stuff. However, since you are an officer first, you possibly could be put into a situation where you don't fly that much, and that's something to consider. So if your end goal is to get to a major airline, you really have to figure out when you get to your service, and once you sign on that dotted line, you've got to make sure you take your career in your hands and you do what path is available to you in order to continue to keep flying and building hours. That means you're probably going to have to be a politician at times. You're probably going to have to figure out how to communicate with people that you do not like. You're probably going to have to figure out how you can get yourself in a situation to be able to have access to the flight schedule. I don't know. I'm just saying here, food for thought. This is a lot of stuff that could possibly happen that you need to think about. So other things to consider when you're thinking about becoming a military pilot, because you want the military to pay for your flight training. Well, I did mention that I went to Iraq, right? I did mention that when you go to war, you come back a little bit differently. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but I am going to say that when you join the military, your mental perspective will change. Some things will be very good. Some things maybe not so good. A lot of people, especially combat vets, come back with situations, especially when they see a lot of gruesome stuff, where you may have to sacrifice some of your mental sanity, which is perfectly okay. It's perfectly all right, because most reasonable people out there, when they join the military, they don't expect to see human beings do a lot of bad things to other human beings. It's totally normal in order to have a reaction to that, especially when you deal with the flight or fight, and then all of a sudden you come back from war. Basically, what I'm talking about is you could experience some mental health stuff such as PTSD. The good news about it is that it's all coming to light. The FAA is getting on board with figuring out how to make this not as much as a stigma, so that people can get the care that they need in order to recover and reintegrate back into normal society. I have resources down below. If you could be one of those pilots out there and you're watching that, I would be more than happy to help you. Okay, so please, down below, reach out to those specific resources. There's help out there for anybody that needs it, okay? Some of the really cool positive things that I gained from the military was, I gotta be honest, I don't know what kind of a path I was on. I was a helicopter pilot. Man, I was surfing in California, and then I'd open up the flight school early in the morning, but quite honestly, my life didn't really have any direction. I didn't know which way I was going to go. So the cool thing when I joined the United States Army was I went to basic training. I was working out a lot, 24-hour fitness. I don't know if they still exist. I was really, really getting some big biceps and getting all nice and strong and swole and trying to impress the girls. However, that helped me through basic training, but I had no guidance. Being honest, my dad wasn't in my life. There's a whole story about that I could talk about later, but it gave me a way to formulate a plan and work with others, and also be an extremely stressful environment. And no matter what would happen, I would make sure that I would figure out how to grit it out and get it done and get through the mission. So what did that do? That helped give me guidance, checklists moving forward, to be able to understand that if I do A, then B, then C, guess what? I'm probably going to get to the end goal D, and I'm going to accomplish what I wanted to do. That thought process is carried with me into other jobs, such as job application processes. I left the United States military, and I wanted to become a Customs and Border Protection helicopter pilot, and I knew that there were specific things that I had to do. There were specific things that I had to do to become competitive, and I also had to prove myself, especially through job interviews, a flight test, background investigation, and also getting through the Customs Academy, and I needed to have some experience to draw on. The best part of that, my military career in the United States Army prepared me for that stress. Therefore, I got through it. That experience built up a tremendous amount of communication skills, non-bias skills. What do I mean by non-bias skills? When you join the United States military, the best thing I love is you're going to be around different walks of life. You're going to be around different races. You're going to be around different people with varying spiritual views. And then guess what? You get all put into this grinder, shooken up, and you get spit out. And quite frankly, I have the ability to communicate with anybody, anywhere, because I have a different view of the world than having something, for lack of better words, which could be ignorant and blocking me from moving forward and experiencing beautiful communication with another human being that I would love to get to know about. That is one cool thing that has happened for me from the military. The next thing I love about the fact the military, I did not have a stable paycheck. I didn't have a stable paycheck whatsoever when it came to flying helicopters back in Torrance, California in 1998 through 99 and even through 2000. I was making roughly $1,200 a month, and I barely had any flight students. I think I was getting paid $15 an hour, and I would also open up the flight-based office because I was the manager helping schedule things. But my point is this, is that as soon as I joined the United States Army, I went straight into a very stable paycheck. My paycheck as a Warrant Officer 1, I forget, I was making $3,000 a month. To me, that was crazy, especially being 21 years old. And the cool thing about it is no matter what was going on, the United States military usually got their paycheck, right? The next thing was too, I went to Customs and Border Protection. You usually get your paycheck. So pay stability was a tremendous thing. Wow, here's another thing, medical benefits. I didn't have any health insurance when I was teaching people how to fly helicopters. I couldn't afford it. I was $1,200 living in California. At the time, I was living in a bad neighborhood with my my buddy, Dan, who's out there, who's helped me through my life and career. If you're watching this, buddy, I love you. We were splitting rent on an $800 a month apartment, which was in a real bad area. But you got to do what you got to do. You got to persevere. And at times I was also sleeping on couches when I couldn't afford to pay. So those are the things that I had to go through. As soon as I joined the military, man, I could pay for my own car payment. I could get an apartment. I started realizing, oh, I got to pay insurance. Oh my God. All these things started happening for me when I was a younger kid and trying to figure it out in life. That was the coolest thing about the military. You do have a pathway for that. Oh, another cool thing I totally forgot to mention, and I've actually experienced this now. So, joined the military, I got out, did my service commitment, and I ended up, the benefits that you get when you receive are really great. Okay, I don't know how many times I've bought a few houses and I have access to VA benefits. Those VA benefits could be healthcare. They could be, number one thing I'm going to tell you right now is a VA loan. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the news. Interest rates are really high. Down payments are really highly necessary. A lot of people right now, if you have access to a VA loan, sometimes you don't have to pay closing costs and you don't necessarily need to have a down payment, which gives you access to housing. That's really cool. Plus, the VA, you have access to tons of resources when it comes to the GI Bill. You can get additional ratings. You can get additional degrees. I took advantage of the GI Bill, and that's what I did. I went and I used it to get my airplane add-on ratings. All right. I accidentally figured out how to get my private pilot license paid for by the GI Bill. And then I also got my instrument commercial utilizing those 48 months of benefits. I also got a 4-year degree in 1 year, which I'm going to make a video about because nobody understands how the benefit systems work. All right. I'm also going to talk about, I got paid extra money when I was working for Customs and Border Protection because there is an on-the-job apprenticeship type of program that the VA applies. So you take those years of benefits, and what happens is the VA will pay you cash. It was very difficult on my wife and I. We needed to have a little bit of extra cash when I went to San Diego, California on a very lower paycheck, let's just say. And we needed to have something in order to get through the hump to get to the next pay grades. So the other things are too, there are tons of websites out there that offer great military discounts, right? You have govx.com. Tons of fitness companies will give you a discount on, workout equipment if that's your thing. There are so many different avenues. Mainly I forget about is what's happening now, which was not available to me, is a program called SkillBridge. So you could be exiting the military, and what can happen is you can get trained. So I actually ran into, when I was getting my certified flight instructor certificates at Sky Warrior, there was a gentleman in the Navy who was using SkillBridge he was a helicopter pilot in the Navy. SkillBridge was paying for him to get his airplane licenses in order to go to the airlines. So there are tons of resources. Right now, the caveat to this is with the contracts that they have now. You're going to be investing bare minimum, depending on your situation, at least 8 years, depending on the service. Maximum 10 years committed active duty service. You got to think about that. Personally, I joined the military and 9/11 just happened. Overnight, the aviation industry changed. I could not fly a helicopter VFR for over 2 months because of the way the FAA completely shut down the airspace system at the time. So luckily, I had my packet in to go into the U.S. Army, and with everything that just happened, it was light speed. Before I knew it, I was in basic training and I was off to flight school, which was great because I was starting to run out of money very quickly as a young, struggling certified flight instructor, especially in helicopters, because most people don't want to pay helicopter training, right? Something to think about. If you're going to be joining the military, I want you to look at my video, this one that you're seeing here. I want you to go through YouTube, find other videos, and I really want you to bite the bullet. Try to find other pilots out there that were military pilots and pick their brain, because at the end of the day, it's going to be your decision. That decision is going to have a whole new perception, and you're going to see things in a completely different manner than what I'm telling you or somebody else. I can tell you this, that if I didn't join the Army and if I wasn't in aviation, there's obviously no way I would be working for a major airline. The other things are too, if I didn't join the Army, I wouldn't have the resources available later in order to get my airplane licenses to be competitive in order to become a major airline pilot. That's something that you should consider as well. The struggles of being a military aviator is you do not own your time anymore. Okay, when you sign on that dotted line, if you're married and you have kids, your wife, your kids, your husband, your kids, your spouse, your kids, guess what? They are second. It's a really good idea to pay attention what's going on in the heartbeat of the world right now. We all know what's going on in Gaza. We all know with the issues of Iran, Hamas, and what you have with Israel. You also have Russia. They're acting absolutely crazy. You got the whole thing going on in Ukraine. Last and not least, you have to think about what's going on over in China, and especially with Taiwan. So there are two ways to look at this. It could be an awesome time to become a military pilot and try out, and it could also be a really bad time. The way it could be really awesome is I'm very thankful that I got my combat experience in Iraq as a helicopter pilot, because now I know that I've been in stressful situations. I feel very comfortable and very humble to be able to handle situations moving forward, especially when it comes to my life. I've had problems, that are unforeseen. Life becomes life. My poor kid, he had some health concerns. We figured it out when we got through it. So it makes you persevere. Other things are too, is that besides learning and getting combat experience, is like, man, what a time to be in aviation. Sometimes I even fantasize when you watch some of those really, really cool documentaries, or, the Steven Spielberg's, like the latest one was Masters of the Air, flying a B-17 for whatever reason, the nostalgia sets in, especially being a pilot. You kind of ask yourself, what if? Well, if you join the military, you may have that opportunity to find out what if. It all depends on your perspective moving forward. I can tell you this, if you don't like being told what to do, and if you don't like not having control of your life, the military is probably not going to be for you. Something to think about. Also, quite honestly, even still, I've got to answer to the airline that I work for, and I've got to do what that airline tells me to do, because I'm still working for somebody else, right? Maybe, who knows? You can take a loan out and become a pilot on your own and be a contract CFI, and you can write your own ticket. Maybe you can get really good in business with it. Maybe you can get your own airplane. So that's another path as well. Hopefully this video gave you a little insight moving forward if you were thinking about becoming a military pilot. I know there are tons of pros, tons of cons, and it's something you have to weigh very heavily, because no matter what, when you sign on that dotted line, you are married to Uncle Sam, and there's absolutely nothing you can really do except for doing something really dumb while you're in the military and ruining your career moving out because you get a dishonorable discharge. Trust me, you don't want that. I've seen it from other guys. That's about the only thing you can do to get out of it. So when you're in for the long haul. All right. If you found this video helpful, if you found it useful, if you want answers to other questions and you want to see another video that could possibly help you, please put it in the comments below. It will help me make more content for you, so that therefore you guys get value out of it. All right. So please like, comment, subscribe, give me a subscription. This is my specific aviation content channel, John the Pilot. See ya.